They didn't just build a fence on my land. They built it like they owned the place. Straight lines, bright white vinyl, little polished signs every 20 feet like it was some kind of theme park boundary. Private property. No trespassing. Yeah, on my property. And the funny part is I didn't even find out until I got back from a 2-day cattle auction. Just rolled up in my truck expecting the same open pasture I'd been working for over 20 years, and instead I'm staring at what looks like the front gate to a suburban HOA brochure. I remember slowing the truck down, squinting a little, thinking maybe I took a wrong turn, which doesn't make sense because I know every inch of that road, every dip, every rut, every tree that leans just a little too far into the lane. But there it was, a clean, artificial line cutting straight across what used to be my south pasture, and not just near the edge either. No, this thing was deep in there, like somebody took a ruler and said, "Yeah, this part's ours now," and just claimed it. Now let me give you a picture so you understand why this hit the way it did. I've got about 40 acres out there, nothing fancy, just working land, grass that rolls with the wind, a dirt access path I carved out myself back in the late 90s so I could move hay trucks through without tearing up the soil. It's not pretty, but it's mine. Always has been. Clean deed, surveyed, recorded, no disputes, no shared access, nothing complicated. Right behind that pasture, though, that's where things changed. About 3 years ago, this new development popped up. They call it Silver Creek Estates. Sounds peaceful, right? Like birds chirping and neighbors waving over white picket fences. Yeah, no. It's one of those gated communities, matching mailboxes, identical driveways, security cameras pointed at everything that moves, and a rulebook longer than most novels. The kind of place where your grass height is apparently a moral issue. Before they showed up, that land behind me was just scrub. Nobody cared about it. Nobody even looked twice. But now suddenly it's all property values and community standards and whatever else people say when they want control over things that don't belong to them. So I park the truck, step out, and just stand there for a second, wind blowing like it always does. Except now it's hitting that plastic fence and making this weird hollow sound. Not the same as open land. Not the same at all. And I start walking toward it, boots hitting dirt I've walked 1,000 times. Except now there's this barrier telling me I don't belong there. And then I see the signs. Not just one, dozens of them, bolted on like they were making a point. Community boundary. No trespassing. Residents only. I actually laughed for a second, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd it didn't feel real, like I'd stepped into someone else's problem by accident. Then I checked the line, and that's when the laugh stopped. That fence wasn't near the boundary. It was about 100 feet into my land. Not a mistake, not a guess, not, oops, we misread the map. No, this was deliberate, measured, installed with confidence, like they knew exactly what they were doing. I walked along it, just tracing it with my eyes, and that's when I noticed something else that made my stomach tighten a little. Gravel. Fresh gravel, spread out in a long strip behind the fence. And parked on top of it cars. Rows of them. SUVs, sedans, a couple of trucks, all lined up neat like they belonged there. Like this had been their parking lot for a while. And then it clicked. They weren't just building a fence. They were using my land, actively, repeatedly, probably every weekend when they had their little community events. And the access? Yeah, they were using my road. That same dirt lane I built decades ago, the only flat, easy path into that section, they'd been driving on it like it was public property, like I'd built it for them. I didn't say anything right away. Didn't call, didn't knock, didn't make a scene. I just went back to the house. Mailbox had something waiting, folded nice and neat, like they were doing me a favor. Letter from the HOA. I opened it standing right there by the truck, and I'll never forget the wording because it was so polished, so careful, like they were trying to sound reasonable while doing something completely unreasonable. They said my pasture appeared to be an used buffer land, and that, in the interest of community safety and enhanced property value, they had adjusted the boundary to create a more secure perimeter. Adjusted the boundary, like it was a settings menu. Like land ownership is something you can just tweak. They didn't ask, didn't notify me, didn't even pretend to get permission. They just decided. And the tone of that letter, that's what really got me. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't rude, it was worse than that. It was confident, like they expected me to just accept it, like I'd read it, shrug, and go, well, I guess that makes sense, and move on with my life, while they quietly absorbed part of my property into their little controlled environment. I stood there for a while, letter in one hand, looking back at that fence, those cars, that gravel strip cutting into my pasture like a scar, and I remember thinking, they really believe this is theirs now. Not borrowed, not temporary, theirs. And that's when something shifted. Not anger, not yet, something quieter than that, something colder. Because I've dealt with disputes before, fence lines, neighbors, misunderstandings, it happens when you work land long enough. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision, a calculated one. They saw open space, assumed it was unused, assumed I wouldn't notice, or wouldn't care, or wouldn't fight it, and they moved in like it was empty territory waiting to be claimed. And standing there, looking at their cars sitting on my soil, I realized something else. They had a weakness. Because that entire parking setup, all those vehicles, all that convenience they'd built for themselves, it depended on my land. My road, my pasture. Without it, they had nothing. And that's when I stopped feeling surprised and started thinking. Now let me pause the story for a second, because what happened here? This isn't just some random neighbor dispute. This is actually a pretty textbook example of how HOA overreach starts and why it gets out of control so fast. According to standard procedure, a homeowners association has authority only within the boundaries that are legally defined in their governing documents. Things like the plat map, CC and AMP, RS, and recorded surveys, and those boundaries don't just move because a board votes on it or decides something looks better on paper. From a legal perspective, what they did crosses into what's called encroachment, and in some cases even trespass, especially when you're talking about permanent structures like fences and improvements like gravel parking. That's not a misunderstanding. That's physical occupation of land you don't own, and courts take that pretty seriously. But here's where it gets interesting. This is also a psychological trap. This is a psychological trap that HOAs, and honestly, groups in general, fall into all the time. They see unused space and interpret it as unclaimed space, and once a few people agree on that idea, it snowballs into collective confidence. Nobody questions it anymore, because everyone else is acting like it's already true. And the longer it goes unchallenged, the more real it feels to them. That's the dangerous part. Because by the time someone pushes back, they're not just correcting a mistake. They're threatening something the group already believes they own. So yeah, once that thought settled in, that quiet realization that their whole setup depended on my land, everything kind of snapped into focus, not in a loud, dramatic way, more like a switch flipping somewhere in the back of my head. And I remember just folding that letter slowly, sliding it back into the envelope, like I was putting their little explanation away for later, because I already knew I wasn't going to argue this out on paper. I didn't drive over to their gate, didn't call the number on the letter, didn't knock on anyone's door. Instead, I walked straight into my barn. Now, if you've ever spent time around working equipment, you know there's a certain kind of quiet in there, not peaceful exactly, more like focused, like everything inside has a purpose and it's just waiting for you to decide what that purpose is today. And sitting there in the corner was my skid steer, dusty, reliable, and next to it a stack of steel livestock panels, heavy-duty, 12-foot sections, the kind you use when you need to contain something that really doesn't want to be contained. And I just stood there for a second, looking at them. Then I nodded to myself. Because suddenly, the solution felt obvious. Not loud, not messy, just effective. That afternoon, I got to work. I drove the skid steer out toward that parking area they'd carved into my pasture. Engine humming low, steady, like it knew something was about to happen. And the closer I got, the more I could see just how comfortable they'd gotten. Cars parked in clean rows, not a care in the world, no signs of hesitation, no indication that any of these people thought they were somewhere they shouldn't be. Which, honestly, made it easier. I started with the outer edge, lining up those steel panels one by one, driving them into the ground deep enough that they weren't going anywhere, chaining them together at the joints, locking each section as I went, no gaps, no weak points, and I worked my way around slow and methodical, like I was building a perimeter, because that's exactly what I was doing. One side, then the next. I could feel a couple people watching from a distance, probably residents walking their dogs or standing on their patios, trying to figure out what I was doing, but nobody came over, nobody said a word, and I didn't explain anything. Didn't need to. By the time the sun started dropping, casting that orange light across the grass, The whole area was sealed, every entrance blocked, every exit closed off, and sitting right in the middle of it were their cars. Trapped, not damaged, not touched, just contained. Like cattle in a pen. I shut off the skid steer, climbed down, checked the locks one more time, gave one of the panels a firm shake just to be sure, and then I walked back to the house like it was any other day, like I'd just finished a routine job. That night was quiet. Too quiet. Because I knew what was coming. And sure enough, the next morning, my phone lit up like it was on fire. Calls, texts, voicemails stacking up one after another. First it was residents, confused, frustrated, some of them polite, some of them already angry, asking why they couldn't get their cars out, asking if there'd been some kind of mistake, and I let most of those go to voicemail, not because I didn't care, but because this wasn't something I was going to explain 20 different times. Then came the HOA board. Different tone entirely. Now it was accusations. You can't do this. This is illegal. You're detaining private property. And I remember leaning back in my chair, listening to one of those voicemails play out, the guy's voice getting sharper with every sentence, like if he just pushed hard enough the situation would bend back into something he could control. So I called them back. Not all of them. Just the number listed on the letter. They picked up fast. Didn't even let me say hello before launching into it, talking about liability, emergency access, resident rights, all the usual buzzwords people reach for when they're trying to sound authoritative. And when he finally paused, I just said, calm as anything, you're parked on my land. Silence. Then more talking, faster this time, trying to redirect, trying to reframe it like the real issue was what I'd done, not what they'd already done before that. So I cut in. I sent you the survey. Check your email. Because yeah, before I even made that call, I'd already scanned and sent over everything. Deed, survey, photos of where their fence actually sat compared to the legal boundary, timestamps, the whole thing, clean and simple, no room for interpretation. There was a pause on the other end after that. A longer one. Because now, this wasn't just a situation anymore. Now it was evidence. About an hour later, their HOA president showed up in person. And this guy, he came in hot, marched right up like he owned the ground he was standing on, pointing at the panels, raising his voice, talking about lawsuits, emergency vehicle access, how I was putting people at risk, and I just stood there, hands in my pockets, letting him run out of steam. Then I nodded toward the white vinyl fence behind him. You built first, I said. He blinked. Didn't like that. I just finished the job. And that landed. You could see it in his face. That moment where the argument he came prepared to make didn't quite fit anymore, because the logic had flipped on him, and now he was standing inside the exact problem they created. Day 2. That's when things really started to fall apart for them. People couldn't get to work. Ride shares were pulling up to the outer road and turning around. Delivery drivers were canceling orders. At least one tow company showed up, took a look at the setup, and decided real quick they weren't getting involved in that mess. And the complaints? Oh, they spread fast. Local Facebook groups picked it up first. You know how those go. Half the comments calling me a hero, the other half acting like I'd declared war on suburban families. Then a local news crew got wind of it, showed up with cameras, started filming the fence, the panels, interviewing whoever would talk. Suddenly, it wasn't just an HOA issue anymore. It was public. And that changes everything. Because once something goes public, people start caring about how it looks, not just how it works. By day 3, the sheriff rolled out. Calm guy. Didn't rush in, didn't take sides right away, just walked the line, looked at the fence, looked at the panels, then came over and asked for documentation. So I handed it over. Survey first. Deed next. He took his time with it too, flipping through, matching it up with what he was seeing on the ground. And then he walked over to the HOA folks, who by that point were very eager to have him resolve the situation. I stayed where I was. Didn't interrupt. Didn't push. And after a few minutes, he came back, gave a small shrug, and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Looks like a civil matter. That was it. No orders. No demands. No threats. Just reality. Because legally, I hadn't damaged anything. Hadn't taken anything. I'd just restricted access to my own land. And they were the ones who had put themselves in that position to begin with. That afternoon, the tone shifted. No more yelling. No more threats. Now it was negotiation. They reached out, calmer this time, asking what it would take to resolve things, and I kept it simple. remove the fence, restore the land, reseed the grass, compensate for lost grazing time. And if they ever wanted to use that access road again, we put it in writing. Permanent agreement. Clear terms. No assumptions. There was some back and forth, of course, a little hesitation, a few attempts to soften the terms, but at that point, they didn't have much leverage left. Not with their residents stuck. Not with the story spreading. Not with the paperwork stacked against them. So eventually, they agreed. Everything. In writing. Signed. Only then did I walk back out to those panels, unlock the chains one by one, pull sections aside, opening it up the same way I closed it, steady, controlled, no rush. Cars started leaving almost immediately. No one made eye contact, which, honestly, I understood, because by then, the lesson had already been learned. So yeah, a couple weeks later, everything looked pretty much the way it used to, grass growing back in where they'd laid that gravel, the fence now sitting exactly where it should have been from the start, right on the actual property line, not an inch over, not even close, and my cattle were back out there like none of it ever happened, just grazing, moving slow, not a care in the world, which, funny enough, is exactly how that land's supposed to feel. But I'll tell you this, the people over at Silver Creek Estates, they don't use that side anymore. They rerouted everything. Longer drive, tighter turns, way less convenient, and you can almost feel the frustration every time you pass by, like the whole neighborhood learned a lesson they didn't expect to learn when they signed those HOA papers. And that's really where this whole thing lands. Because on the surface, yeah, it's a satisfying story. Somebody crosses a line, gets a little too comfortable, and then reality snaps back into place in a way that's, let's be honest, kind of poetic. But underneath that, there's something more practical going on here. The lesson here is, ownership doesn't disappear just because it's quiet. Just because land looks unused, open, or available doesn't mean it is. And more importantly, if you don't push back when someone crosses that line, even a little, even in a way that seems harmless at first, it doesn't stay small. It grows. Because people, especially in groups, tend to test boundaries slowly, they don't jump straight to taking over 100 feet of land overnight. It starts with little assumptions. No one's using this. It's probably fine. We'll just adjust things slightly. And before you know it, those small steps stack up into something that feels permanent. That's how you lose ground. Not all at once, but inch by inch, decision by decision, until the original line doesn't even exist in people's minds anymore. And that's where most folks get caught off guard, because they wait too long to say something. They try to be polite, avoid conflict, give the benefit of the doubt, and by the time they act, they're not correcting a mistake anymore. They're trying to undo a system that's already been built around that mistake. From a legal perspective, timing matters more than people think. The longer an encroachment sits uncontested, the more complicated it can become to resolve. You start getting into things like prescriptive rights or adverse possession, depending on the state. And while those aren't easy to claim, they're messy, they're expensive, and they turn something simple into a drawn-out fight nobody really wants. That's why clarity early on is everything. Not aggression, not escalation. Clarity. And here's the other side of it. This isn't just about land, it's about mindset. This is a psychological trap a lot of structured communities fall into, especially HOAs, where decision-making gets filtered through committees, boards, and shared assumptions, and somewhere along the way, responsibility gets diluted. No single person feels fully accountable, so decisions start feeling safer than they actually are. That should be fine. Everyone agrees. We're improving things. And because it's framed as improvement, people stop questioning whether they have the right to do it in the first place. That's how overreach happens. Not always out of malice. Sometimes out of convenience. Sometimes out of ego. Sometimes just because nobody stopped to ask the most basic question. Is this actually ours to control? And look, I'm not saying every HOA is like that. Some of them run clean, follow the rules, respect boundaries, handle things the way they're supposed to. But when they don't, when they start operating on assumption instead of fact, that's when situations like this show up. And when they do, you've got two choices. You either let it slide and hope it doesn't get worse, or you draw a line. Clear, undeniable. And sometimes, that line looks like a locked gate. Or in my case, a pen full of cars that suddenly reminded a whole neighborhood what private property actually means. Now I'm curious what you think about this, because situations like this always split people right down the middle. Some folks say I went too far, that I should have handled it through lawyers first, kept it formal, avoided the disruption, and I get that perspective, I really do. But others look at it and say this is exactly what needed to happen, because without that immediate consequence, nothing would have changed. It would have dragged on, gotten buried in paperwork, maybe even normalized over time. So where do you land on it? Was this just standing your ground, or crossing a line to prove a point? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd probably expect, and I'm always interested in how different people see situations like this, especially when law, property, and human behavior all collide in the same place. And if you enjoy stories like this, real situations where entitlement runs headfirst into reality, go ahead and hit subscribe, because I've got a few more that might make you look at fences, neighborhoods, and private property a little differently next time you pass one.